Uh, Good afternoon and thank you. My name is Kiran Sarma and I'm a lecturer in the School of Psychology and I'm a forensic psychologist. And I just want to acknowledge the input of Katie Cox, who's a second author and one of my PhD students and did a lot of great work on this project. I've been working for the Road Safety Authority now since about 2012. And in recent years, we've done work on serious road traffic offending leading to driver disqualification. Last year, I was here talking about impaired driving around, or distracted driving, including mobile phone use while driving. And I think some of the overarching conclusions I'd reached today echo some of the conclusions I've reached from previous research. And that conclusion, just to put the end first, is that, like today we were talking a lot about the deterrent value of detection and enforcement. And I think that's really important because it provides this really powerful external psychological motivation to change our behavior, and that's critically important. But the flip side of that is about the empowerment of people to make choices, better choices themselves in the world. And that's about internal psychological processes. And that's what I'm really interested in. How do people think about their behavior, and how could we use that thinking as a fulcrum for behavioral change? So I'll be picking up on some of the thoughts that were mentioned this morning along the way as well. This is a work in progress, so we're a couple of weeks away from the finished report, so I don't have specific recommendations for road safety stakeholders just yet, but I think the themes that have emerged from the research are very important to today's proceedings. And just to set the scene and to kind of situate this within the internal psychological processes, this is an excerpt from one of our interviews with our young drivers. So I'll go through it, and I think it's relevant because I'll show you afterwards, as I analyze the piece of text, what's actually going on within the mind of drivers who drug drive, okay? So the driver goes, and this driver is now in early 30s, reflecting on his behavior in his 20s when he did engage in drug driving. The drug driving is cannabis use within 6 hours of driving the vehicle, so impaired driving. So the driver goes, the usual session might start out in the morning. So we think that we might associate drug taking with an evening activity. Actually, dependent cannabis users will often wake up in the morning and the first thing they will do is roll a joint. Okay? If they're dependent, they could be dependent because they're managing anxiety, and this is suppressant, or a regulatory process that they use to manage their anxiety. So it starts in the morning. I'd wake up, hang out with the lads, and then we'd start smoking. We'd smoke then for the morning, just hanging out and having a laugh. Lighter would run out, no matches. Sure, I'll get a light. Into the car I'd go. No complaints from the lads. The biggest issue then isn't that I'd be in a collision. I'd be careful, like. I knew I was impaired, but I was so careful. Like when you're stoned, you think everyone knows you're stoned, like you're paranoid. And so you're making that extra effort to appear sober. So slower than normal, cautious, keep it between the lines. But then I'd find myself outside work. I missed a turn, just an autopilot, no concentration. I actually believed that I was a better driver when I was stoned because I was more careful. Then later we'd have a few drinks, we'd keep smoking, then out for the night, no plans to drive of course, but I'd wake up in the morning having driven home. That's the difference between drugs and drink. When you're smoking, you have no excuse because you know what you're doing. When you're drink driving, the drink is in charge. The drink is worse than the drugs, you know. Then again, cocaine is the worst. I work in security, and you see the lads coked up. Can't imagine that behind the wheel, crazy stuff. Then he reflects on the origins of it. And he goes, I don't know why I started taking drugs when I was younger. I used to think it was being one of the lads. We'd drive to the top of the hill at night. We'd be able to see cars coming up the hill, like 10 minutes warning. It's a good time to dump the stuff. I thought it was a bit of crack and a bit of fitting in. But I was depressed, suicidal at the time, smoking with the lads in the car. It was 2 hours of the giggles, and I think I felt like normal for that time. I don't think I was alone in that. As I got older, it became less and less about fitting in and more about escaping. So, looking at the psychological processes, here he's talking about, I'd wake up, hang out with the lads. There'd be no complaints from the lads when you get into the car to go down and get the light because they've run out of lights. And it was seen as just a bit of crack and fitting in. And the process here is peer influence, or the normative influences of family and friends. Here it's peers. And this is really important because what we know from the data on drug misuse, and I'll talk a bit about it later on, is that about a quarter of young males will report drug taking in the last 12 months. Okay? Now, that means 75% of young males haven't taken drugs in the last in the last 12 months. So it's not all young male drivers. It's happening within peer groups. In this guy's particular peer group, drug driving is accepted. There's a permissive attitude towards drug driving in this particular peer group. So peers are really important. Then when we engage in a rule violating behavior, like this guy will say, well, I was impaired, I probably shouldn't be driving on one level. He needs to come up with a series of cognitive distortions to justify the behavior to himself. And so he minimizes the risk associated with drug driving. So he does a kind of a complex cognitive distortion where he goes, well, I know I'm impaired, which makes me more at risk on the road, but if I'm really cautious, I become less at risk on the road than if I was sober. Now, that's a very convoluted process, but absolutely 100% provides a fantastic justification for the offending behavior. I'm actually better stoned than when I'm sober. It's a minimization. There are other cognitive distortions in there. There's an oversimplification and advantageous comparisons. And this one about, like what you see when you talk to drug takers and drug drivers, they'll go, okay, I might drive when I'm stoned, but at least it's better than driving when I'm drunk, or at least it's better than driving when I'm taking cocaine. And again, the advantageous comparison misses the point, but it's much riskier than driving when you're sober. So advantageous comparisons. And then the last thing I'd say, and it's picking up on the comments of the previous speakers, is that like he's talking here about the underlying psychological distress that is probably it's the predisposing risk factor really that's going on in this guy's life. And we spoke earlier about COVID and more risk-taking post-COVID. And of course, the question that arises is society more psychologically distressed now than it was before? And is that coming out as greater levels of drug taking? And is that being manifest in vehicle as more drug driving? So what we know is that what happens in vehicle is a petri dish of what's going on in society. And so there are some things, and I was here last year talking about mobile phone use while driving. Like, we're highly dependent on our mobile phones. And why are we shocked then that dependence comes out in the vehicle? When we are trying to suppress that behavior of using our phones when driving, suppress drink driving and suppress drug driving, we're suppressing something that's endemic in society, and it makes it a really, really challenging thing to try and do. So that's kind of capturing the scene about what are the internal psychological processes that we're interested in. Some more context before I tell you a bit about what we found. So there's some good evidence on, like most of the research in the area is on cannabis misuse while driving. That's the most researched area, okay? If you're driving under the influence of cannabis, your collision risk is estimated to be at least 3 times than if you're driving not under the influence of drugs, okay? We don't have good data for cocaine, but in the last 12 months, if you've taken cocaine, you're 6 times greater chance of being involved in road traffic collision in that time than if you haven't taken cocaine. So we don't have evidence on what happens when you take cocaine on collision risk. There's insufficient data on that. It's only important because these kind of data points help challenge the cognitive distortions I spoke about earlier, and it becomes important context. I've already made the point about what happens in vehicle reflects broader society. Every few years we run this national drug and alcohol survey. It's a sample of about 5,000 people in the Irish community, and what we can see is over the last decade, you see the lifetime prevalence of drug taking, 12-month prevalence rate of drug taking, and 1-month prevalence rate of drug taking, i.e. have you taken drugs in the last month, has all increased in the last decade. Okay? So we know it's becoming more of a problem. So then the other complexity is there's a thing about, today we're talking about sometimes alcohol-impaired driving, sometimes drug driving. Like a lot of the time when people are taking drugs, in the same session they're taking alcohol. It's not all the time, but it can happen that way. And so that's why sometimes when we're interviewing young drivers talking about drug taking, they're going, well, are you talking about the morning when I was taking the drugs, the middle of the day when we were drinking cans, and the evening when we were doing a different drug? So, like, what are we actually talking about in the when we're talking about drug taking? So it's kind of not a black and white thing. There are different drugs being used, and certainly drivers will say, well, drug takers will say, if I'm taking cannabis, I'm mellowed out, I'm more careful. if I'm taking cocaine, I'm stimulated, I'm taking more risks. And so the processes are different. And so even talking about drug driving, in having the conversation, we kind of do need to ask the question, okay, it's always impaired, but what drugs are we talking about and what effects are they having on the driver? Because it's that level of depth that the drivers need to hear for them to be empowered to make better decisions. I mean, the simple message, obviously, is that any drugs that leaves you impaired is a risk to road safety, but the detail of it is actually what educates and builds awareness. There's other parts there about time since drugs consumed, and the level of drugs detected versus drugs impairment, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, because it becomes important in the context of understanding how people talk about their drug and drug driving. So well, our task now from the Road Safety Authority was to draw together the best evidence out there on psychological processes involved in drug driving, and that meant a review of the empirical literature. That was the first part of the project. And the second part of the project was to conduct interviews with a sample of young male drivers to understand their experiences of drug taking and drug driving. We did 2 reviews. One review was a review, or it's called an umbrella review, of published meta-analyses systematic reviews. So these are reviews where they've already drawn together all the evidence. So there are hundreds of studies on cannabis-impaired driving. So they've been synthesized already by other authors in these mega reviews. So we just pulled together those systematic reviews and synthesized them further. And then the last review had been published in 2022, so we did an updated review of the primary research from 2022 to 2025. So, and then we did the interviews with young drivers. Now, because I've only got 10 minutes left and it's a short presentation, what I've done is I've combined the 2 systematic reviews in terms of our findings into a set of slides. The report does each review in turn, but just for the purpose of speeding things up, I'm presenting the findings together today. That's, if you're any interested in syntax used in these reviews, what we do is we create a syntax and we put it into search engines online. We pick a sample of search engines and they help us identify these systematic reviews, our primary studies, and then we basically go through those studies, we extract relevant information and data, and we put it all together. These are just Prisma charts, and the last box in each chart is the important thing. There are 3 existing review papers already published that we synthesized first, and then there are 21 additional primary studies published since 2022 that we went on to synthesize afterwards. Now, so the findings from both reviews combined, all the themes that have emerged are relevant to both reviews, and one is only relevant to the updated review, and I'll talk about that as I go on. So, what were the psychological processes involved in drug driving? And almost all this literature base relates to cannabis-impaired driving, okay? So almost all of this is specifically about cannabis misuse. So what the evidence is saying is that if a history of offending and risky driving is there, you're more likely to be involved in drug driving later. So the value of this really is if you were to try and build a risk profile of who is likely to engage in cannabis misuse driving, these would be your risk factors. A history of offending and risky driving. These are prior convictions, collision, speeding, driving while under the influence, and so on. Personality and temperament, no surprise, it was mentioned earlier about, I suppose, young drivers in general and young male drivers in particular. There is a higher level of sensation seeking and excitement seeking in that demographic than in other groups. If you're an excitement seeker and sensation seeker as a personality trait, well, you're more likely to take risks because your self-regulatory system fails. You're more inclined to take the risk than think through the impact of your behavior. Risk perception, this is about deterrence primarily. It's the deterrent value of, like if you have a low perception of risk around drug driving, that's not just about being detected drug driving, it's also about will I be involved in a collision, will my friends think bad of me if I drug drive, and so on. People who drug drive have associate lower risks across a full gambit of perceptions than those who don't drug drive. Only in our updated review did we find the emergence of literature dealing with mental health difficulties and substance dependence. So it's a more emerging theme in recent years linking underlying psychological distress to drug driving. it vectors through drug dependence. So your underlying psychological distress drives dependence, drives what goes on in vehicle. Really important finding across both parts of our qualitative research and this review is the impact and role of social norms and peer influence. So where there are permissive attitudes towards drug driving and drug taking within peer groups, you find that those norms become established, drug taking becomes habitual, and drug driving is more likely to arise. And we can't underestimate the value of changing normative values within groups as becoming a regulatory process for changing behavior. And it was mentioned earlier, Dennis asked a question about transport access and justifications. This is a widely used across, these studies are globally relevant, they come from different jurisdictions. And that explanation for drug driving is used by drug drivers across the world. It's the idea, well, I had no other option for getting home other than to get behind the wheel. So whether it's in part a psychological justification we use to feel better about ourselves, or a bona fide explanation for what's going on in society, is one that needs to be considered. There is not a psychological finding, but in terms of demographic profiling, obviously we're looking at, in the literature, we're finding that the risk is associated with being male, under the age of 35, and history of earlier cannabis use first, lower academic performance, and in some literature, single-parent homes. So I wouldn't be drawing too much attention or put too much credence in some of the single-parent home finding, for example, because it appears on a very limited number of studies. So conclusions from that review, first of all, well, it's interesting that even within those empirical studies, we're finding that recognizing that drug driving is impairing is insufficient, because what happens is the internal psychological drivers are enough to overwhelm any conscious cognitive processes where you might go, okay, this is a risk, I see that, but then deep down, if the processes are sufficiently strong to drive you towards behavior, it overwhelms your self-regulatory process and you engage in that behavior. Social norms are really important, and in the literature, really strong evidence emerging on risk perceptions, and in particular around police detection. You need to believe you're going to be detected if you're going to be able to suppress any internal driver towards drug driving. And finally, it's about the petri dish effect, as I call it. It's the idea that whatever's happening in society gets reflected in the vehicle. And here we're talking about high levels of drug taking in the community. We shouldn't be surprised when we see that translate into problems on our roads. So then we take all that evidence, and then we go and we do the interviews with our young drivers. So we recruit 25 young drivers, and what we're trying to do is figure out how do they make sense of their lives in the context of drug driving and drug taking. And about half of our drivers are drug drivers. That is, they have taken cannabis or cocaine within 6 hours of getting behind the wheel. The other half of the interviewees are drug users, but don't drug drive. And having those two subgroups within our sample allows us to contrast the psychological processes involved, because it asks the question, why do some engage in the behavior and some not? Okay? So the themes that are emerging really resonate with the synthesis of the empirical literature that I presented earlier. And I've ranked them kind of in order priority in terms of how frequently the themes emerged within the interviews, because we have all the interviews completed. So the first one is the role of peer influence. Now, when we look across our two sets of drivers, the drug drivers and the drug takers that don't drug drive, what we find is a very strong sense that in the sample that don't drug drive, the normative value in the group is that drug taking is okay, but drug driving is not okay. Okay? And that becomes the regulatory process within that group. Within the individuals who report drug driving, they're in a group of drug takers who are saying, but it's actually okay. Okay? So now the regulatory process fails in that group. And I think it's a really important finding, because there is a thing about talking about young male drivers that can lead to kind of a buffering response from young drivers where they feel like they're targeted, and in fact they can kind of feel a sense of rebellion against it. And maybe we need to be thinking about risky driving, and here we're talking about drug driving, arising in peer groups, okay, where that behaviour is condoned. And so we're targeting specific groups of drivers, like little microsystems of drivers where these behaviours are condoned or permitted. So we think that's a really important finding. As mentioned earlier, what's going on in the car is reflecting societal changes, and our driver spoke about that a lot, about drug taking becoming more and more prevalent in society. And I think the people in the room today will have heard all those anecdotal stories. There isn't great evidence around what's going on in society other than drug taking is increasing, but you'll hear about it happening. For example, our driver spoke about, well, I prefer to take cocaine at night because I wake up the following morning, I don't have a hangover, and I can go training. Do you know? So there's also, it can get very complicated when you drill into the stories, because we've had drivers saying, well, you know, I'd drink 4 pints and I'd feel sluggish, I'd take cocaine because it kind of balances things out. Do you know? So it's these, what's going on in society gets translated into the car, I suppose is what I'm saying. Risk perceptions, low perceptions of risk in our drug drivers, high perceptions of risk in our drivers who take drugs and don't drug drive. And the risk perception is primarily about the chance of me being involved in a road traffic collision. There was some talk earlier about the importance of detection and enforcement. Well, the same finding emerges here as with our mobile phone use while driving. Of the 25 drivers, none had been stopped by the guards for a random drug test, for example, and none of their friends had. And so we always ask the question, what do you think is the statistical probability that you'll be detected drug driving? And they say, well, if I haven't been detected and my friends haven't been detected, the probability is 0. Okay? Now, the contrasting finding here is that with the mobile phone use while driving, drivers felt it was a very detectable offence. For drug driving, our driver said, but I kind of understand why it's very hard to detect. So there's an interesting divergence in findings there across those two studies. We had this drug driving versus drink driving, and how our drug drivers keep making these advantageous comparisons that it's not as bad as drink driving. And we think some of these cognitions are ripe for targeting in public health messaging, because they are not helping the situation. Another important theme was around underlying mental health issues, and I mean, we spoke earlier about this, is that some of these road safety issues are not fully amenable to targeting by road safety approaches alone. Drug taking is a public health issue, and it's a public health issue that's panning out in the vehicles. So we need these public health approaches to these problems. And I spoke about cognitive distortions, and I'm conscious that I'm kind of running out of time. We asked our drivers about the perceived effectiveness of prevention techniques, and again, it goes back to, in a way, detection. It's viewed as challenging, but absolutely necessary to reduce behaviour. Like, we did have this kind of theme emerging in the research that our drug drivers, some of them don't want to drug drive, but don't feel they can control it, and they're kind of going, well, we'd prefer if there was more detection activity in the community, because then we'd feel like more empowered to change our behaviour. You know, I mean, I spoke earlier at the very outset of my talk about the importance of empowering people to make better decisions, but that does reflect how they think about it. Finally, my last slide is about the recommendations from the interviewees. These aren't our recommendations, but when we asked our drivers about what they would like to see different, they said, well, we think it's really important to focus on real-life messaging. So what they want to hear is about the real-life stories of drug drivers, how they got involved in drug driving, and what the consequences of their behaviour was. In terms of education and awareness, they said it's really important to challenge the myths out there. We challenged them during the interviews. It's interesting, sometimes they utterly reject it, even though you present data to them and really challenge them hard. They can be very resistant to some of the myth-challenging statements. But that is something that they say would be important. And they always point to the importance of tackling the root cause of psychological distress in society. And I'm going to stop there because I have run out of time. Thank you.